is somebody who works at a seminary and was trained as a rabbi and then as an academician. I really see myself as a bridge sometimes in terms of those two sometimes very different communities. I think, I'm not a spokesperson for HUC-JIR, but I do know that as a historian, I know that over time the College Institute has struggled with its role in the larger Jewish community vis-a-vis academicians and professional training. In other words, with the advent and proliferation of Jewish studies majors and departments on almost every campus you can imagine, I'm sure you know better than I do, what does that mean then for seminaries? What does it mean for rabbis who used to embody the academic kind of intellectual head, so to speak, of the Jewish people? What does that mean? And I know that's something that we think a lot about at the College Institute. I can tell you that we are very much oriented toward a tri-pronged mission, namely the professional development of our students, like dental school, you know, in the way that they need the experience, and they do get the work experience. The second prong being academics, and they get very strong and rich course work and work very hard. What does that mean vis-a-vis someone getting a Ph.D., for instance, right at a secular university? It's a different animal in some ways. And then the third prong is the spiritual and personal training or what's the word I want? Development that we offer and hope our students succeed at. I will say that, and I say this to my students all the time when I begin a course. I teach the basic Jewish history course at HUC and have for many, many years in New York. And I always start my semester with the question, why study history? Why study Jewish history at a seminary? And how is it different from the proverbial across the street? We're located in the heart of NYU country. Those of you who've been down to the New York campus of HUC-JIR know that. And I think there's a very deliberate, at least on my part, a very, very deliberate attempt to inculcate values, to foster Jewish identity, to make the past come alive so that it's relevant to these students in their lives. That's very, very different from the university setting where an objective stance, which we all know now, we talk about among historians and others, it's impossible to be completely objective. But inserting oneself. So to get, there's a long answer perhaps, but I mean, I think the WRJ, I mean, in the best sense of the word, and I teach a course on Reformed Jewish history, and one of my sessions is devoted to what I call the unsung heroes, namely the women of Reformed Judaism who have not been recognized in the history books in the same way, deserved way that others in our movement we can name off. I won't put the male names. And I think that the WRJ becomes a living example for our students in how lay people steer our movement. And I'll come back to, I guess, the social justice question that was asked about, well, what has the women of Reformed Judaism done over time in terms of social justice? I mean, they're on the forefront. You know, early on with the ERA, I'm just writing something else up about the ERA, the Equal Rights Amendment. Early on, the WRJ was out there advocating for the passage of the Equal Rights Amendment in a way that the Reform Rabbinate took a step back and back at the very time, of course, when women were becoming rabbis. So there's a weird irony. So I think it's almost like a checks and balances. At least I'd like to think of it that way. And I do urge the WRJ to keep being vocal, you know, and pushing the powers that be in ways that we all need.
Well, let me say a couple of things. First of all, about women in academia and how they can help the WRJ or the Jewish community in general. One of our colleagues once called Jewish history professors or Jewish studies professors called us secular rabbis. And it's not that we see ourselves as secular rabbis, but it's that the students that we teach look to us for that kind of a model. And but those of us in the university very much tried to distance ourselves from that. But in the end, I think many of us in the end either couldn't or didn't want to. Certainly for some of our students. But what I want to talk about is Jewish women's studies coming into academia, because what you have to remember is that when Jewish studies first evolves, there are almost no women. I mean, I can name the few who were, like Lucy Davidovich, who was at the founding meeting of the Association for Jewish Studies. And so Jewish women's studies doesn't exist. And I'm so old that I've been around for a long time. And I remember going to the first meetings of the Association for Jewish Studies, and the only way I would find any other women to talk to was to go hide out in the ladies' room. And since I was a graduate student, I spent a lot of time in the ladies' room. So Jewish Women's Studies came in, and we created a Jewish Women's Caucus in the Association for Jewish Women's Studies. And now that women are, I saw the stats not long ago, close to half, if not half, of the members of the association. But that was not the way it was. And so Jewish Women's Studies has influenced all areas of Jewish intellectual endeavor now. Those scholars who leave out women in their inquiry, leave out the component of gender, do so at the risk of ridicule from their colleagues. And Jewish Women's Studies ended up impacting not only WRJ in a symposium like this, but also the training of all rabbinical students, because I once wrote an article a number of years ago about how an unanticipated consequence of the emergence of women rabbis was the introduction of Jewish women's studies into the rabbinical seminaries, all of them. So as to comment on Sylvia's point, all the movements, not just, maybe not at Yeshiva University, but certainly I know at the liberal seminaries. As far as the question about second wave feminism and the sense that we don't need sisterhood anymore, I think that was a particular moment in the late 1960s and 1970s when there was this activism around the integration of women into all walks of American life, and there was a sense in many places in American life and in some sections of the Jewish community that therefore you don't need any longer these separatist kinds of organizations. The reality after a few years, and we were speaking about this before, is of having sat at the table and people, of women saying things and then nobody realizing that women said it first, and then a man making the same comment and getting recognition for it. The reality was, for a variety of purposes, some of which were also social, is that the separatist organizations have persisted throughout American life, not just American Jewish life.
So, Jewish women in academia. It's not just that there are more women in the academy now, and not just that men know that they have to actually include women, but they pay attention to different questions. And I think that's been one of the most profound impacts of the entry of women into the academy. The scholarship actually pays attention to different questions. One that comes to mind is looking at women and children in the Holocaust rather than acting as though what happened to everyone was equally horrible. But different things happen to women and children than happen to men. That's just one example, and there are many examples in Jewish studies, in every field of Jewish studies, where men as well as women now pay attention to different questions. They've been sensitized to the range of human experience. I can give you an example to the contrary. Back in the bad old days when I was hearing a lecture on Hasidic Judaism, and the professor explained how the men went to the Rebbe's tish and how they were gone for X amount of time. And when the Q&A came, a woman in the audience raised her hand and said, "And what were the women doing?" And he looked bewildered and said, "Nothing." But now, of course, one would understand that asking that question would be where you should start in terms of doing the research. How are these societies functioning? You really have no idea how the society was functioning unless you look at gender as one of the lenses. And I would say that in the academy, you also worry about developing professional skills, like what do you do when you feel like the guy in Chicago who sings the song Cellophane? I'm made of cellophane. People look right through me. It's an experience that women have all the time, making a point and until some guy repeats exactly what the woman said. Nobody realizes it's been said. So giving women professional skills so that they can learn how to, I'm smitten with Carole, lean in right now, learning how not just to sit at the table, but to make your voice heard at the table. These are important professional skills. How do you dress for an interview? To hit that magic spot where you're just female enough, but not too female. All kinds of things that women need to worry about in the academic world, in addition to turning out fabulous papers. The decline in women's organizations, I think, is the context that we need to put our concern about the, I think, momentary decline of Jewish women's organizations. There was a kind of scorn that was heaped on women's organizations, mostly because women were working and not getting paid. But I think that we have since gotten smarter and understand that both men and women want to be together for part of their time and to work on things for which they get other kinds of compensation besides mere money. Not that I have anything against mere money. And in terms of the social justice question, I always think about how Betty Friedan explained that the reason that she became sensitized to discrimination against women was growing up as a Jew in an environment where she had to experience anti-Semitism. And that made her aware of what it was like to be marginalized. So she learned about women's marginalization by seeing Jewish marginalization. So I think the two things are very linked.
I'm sorry, I have this. So let's start another round of questions, see where we go.
So notwithstanding Dr. Sarna's caution about asking historians about the future, and I think you've touched on this a little bit, but given some of the trends that Dr. Fishman in particular described and some of the comments you've already made, what opportunities do you see specifically for women of Reform Judaism?
Let's take, if there are, another one as well, another question.
Earlier today, we talked about, Earlier today?
Yes.
Earlier today, it was alluded to about men disappearing from temple leadership, lay positions, and to some degree the rabbinate. Chicken or egg, did they disappear and women filled the void, or did women come in and the men disappear?
I don't know if there's another hand. We'll take one more if there is. Otherwise, we've got our hands full. Let's, I guess, start. I think would you like to start?
Yeah, I'll start.
So I'm going to link both of these questions. One is opportunities for women in Reform Judaism, and the other one is the feminization of the Reform movement. One of the things I discovered in the research that I did, and those of you who were in my session this morning heard about this already, is that ambivalence by many Reform men was already evident in the 1930s and 1940s. And the movement of women into the leadership in Reform Judaism did not spook the men. Women are not responsible for pushing men off of the scene. That ambivalence was already present. Now, that having been said, they aren't the same men. You know, the men that were articulating ambivalent feelings in the 1930s and 1940s are not the same men that are not now in the leadership of the Reform movement. But I just want us to be aware of the fact that it wasn't like there was this vibrant, dynamic, unified male leadership which suddenly, at the entry of women, ruined Gan Eden. And now we're suffering the consequences. We live in a complicated world and we have a lot of choices. One of the things that happened, again, this is very structural. Jewish men, during an age where men looked for professions, women weren't so much looking for professions, were kept out of many professions because of quotas. Many medical schools wouldn't allow men to enter. Jewish men. Many medical schools would not allow Jewish men to enter, so Jewish men were forced into medical schools often that weren't their first choice. There were whole fields like chemistry where there were no jobs for Jews. They just wouldn't take, so there are a lot of reasons why brilliant, creative Jewish men went into the rabbinate before the Second World War, and they have other choices today, and that's another reason why there aren't so many Jewish men. Look, there are a lot of things that are happening all at the same time. It's not one thing. Now, I would say that there are certain aspects of feminization which do tend to make young men and boys sometimes feel like religion is a girl thing. One of those is America. We live in an American environment in which religion is seen as a woman's activity. Think of all of the stereotypes of women going to church and men watching football games or going fishing. There's a certain reality. So part of our acculturation into American mores is the idea that religion is something that women do, which you could keep women down as long as they weren't allowed to enter the leadership. But now that they're allowed to enter the leadership, that American idea permeates. So that's one of the things that happens. And I really feel strongly that men and women need to think together about what aspects of Judaism are attractive to boys and men. How can we create environments which are attractive to boys and men without pushing women out of leadership roles, without artificially limiting women's options? The idea is to make Judaism and Jews something which is more compelling for guys without saying that it is a male-exclusive prerogative.
Let me start with the feminization point and pick up on what Sylvia said. In the 19th century, Americans, not American Jews, Americans are complaining about the feminization of religion. The ministers in their churches are saying the only people who are in the pews are females. So this is a really old problem in American life, and in a sense, a more recent problem in American Jewish life since the post-immigrant period, although there's complaints about this in Reform synagogues in the 19th century as well. So I don't have a solution for the concern about feminization. Religion is, exactly as Professor Fishman said, seen in the United States as something that women do, and that we would have to make it more compelling. We have to make religion more compelling to men and to women, frankly, given the concern in the decline of organized religion in general. And that's something that we as Americans need to think about. But I want to think about opportunities for WRJ. So, like my colleague, Professor Sarna, my standard answer is I'm a historian. I don't know anything about the future. And so at the risk of betraying my thoughts, I think an area that we as American Jews need to be thinking about very seriously is Israel and a relationship to Israel in terms of religion. I very firmly feel that the American model, as you said before, I mean, American Judaism doesn't look anything like Judaism anywhere else in the world. And that's because of a blend of America and Judaism. And so we created something sui generis, essentially, here. But Israel is at maybe because of the recent issue about what might happen in terms of changing the prayer spaces at the wall, Israel might be poised at a moment to be a little bit more open to some of the insights that we as American Jews have to bring to the nation. There's a new book out about, if Israel stays the way it's going to, about a potential civil war between the Orthodox and the secular Jews. So if you're looking for a challenge, I don't know how to respond, but that's a place that I would be looking for, is what could the women of Reform Judaism do in terms of introducing a more egalitarian Judaism, a Judaism that's sensitive to the sentiments of liberal Judaism that's more open to our Western constructions of modernity, and introducing that into the state of Israel.
I would add, I have a microphone, so it's easier. Yes. I would add about the future and the opportunities for WRJ. For those of you who were at my workshop this morning, we discussed uniongrams. I know probably everyone in this room is familiar with them, but these are the decorative cards, right, that were started by this organization in 1913-14, and in 40 years you sold 3 million of these uniongrams. I studied the period from 1913 to 1953. That's a lot of uniongrams. And in that time period raised about $500,000, which is a lot of money today, and all the more so, right, if you count backward. And at the end of my presentation this morning, I compared, I looked for, in doing the research, I looked for another gender-segregated group that I could compare, that was selling something that I could compare with the WRJ and the Uniongrams, or NFTS at the time, and Uniongrams. And I thought about the Girl Scouts. I talked about the Girl Scouts this morning. And the Girl Scouts were founded in 1915, 2 years after WRJ, or NFTS, by Juliette Lowe Gordon. Gordon Lowe, excuse me. And she was very direct that the girls were to be trained in all sorts of ways, not only to be homemakers, but that too, and sewing and all the rest, but also outside the home and what would happen. Now, at the same time, the NFTS women, right, are emerging, going outside their home, developing what one scholar calls invisible careers, right? You're out there working, sometimes maybe more than a 40-hour work week. You're not getting paid for it, but it is indeed a career. And when you read the resumes of women sitting in this room, or women of the past whom we've celebrated today, there can be no doubt that they were career women. In terms of, so to get back to the Girl Scouts for a minute, the three chief differences between cookie sales and Uniongram sales, right, when we think about Girl Scout cookies and their proliferation, and now they're like an American cultural icon in some ways. The Girl Scouts, by the way, they didn't start selling cookies on a national level until the 1930s, but they did publish recipes in their public record known as the American Girl. We don't know if it has anything to do with the doll. We discussed that in the meeting this morning. But they started to publish recipes for cookies in the American Girl, and then they gave the price, what it would cost, between 36 and 38 cents to make 6 to 7 dozen cookies. So if you wanted to raise money, this was a way to do it. But every time a cookie was sold, the proceeds went back to the organization, to the local chapter. Compare Uniongrams. Where did the money go, all that money go? And to great causes, to HUC-JIR, and first Free Religious Schools, and then HUC-JIR, that dorm that was built that Dr. Sola referred to earlier this afternoon. That's one chief difference. Who is getting the proceeds, right? The women of Reform Judaism have had a history, and I don't know if it's a legacy, but a history of self-effacement. You all have that know-how. I mean, and that's not the know-how maybe that we need, Cheryl Sandberg notwithstanding. But what are you already trained in that you could share out there? The nifty kids. I mean, when we talk about, Dr. Sarna talked about the impact of Sisterhood Shabbat, they would call them Sabbaths, I'm sure, right? Sisterhood Sabbaths, where women were out there, right? They were leading, and that changed everything, right? People start to see women leading. I read also with Nifty, the fact that camps, right, at the youth group camps in the summer, girls were leading services just like the boys. So, you know, why wouldn't they become rabbis? So anyway, my point is, I think there's a lot of potential there, and I urge you to go in that direction. Maybe one more question or two, and then we'll hand the mic over to Lynn.
This has indeed been an incredible day, and I have to tell, most of you in this room know that I'm very new to the women's part of WRJ, very new to WRJ, and I am so totally proud and overwhelmed by what I've experienced this weekend, particularly today. What you just said the last few minutes really hits me when I think about the future of the role of the women Reform Judaism, because there is an enormous future, but it's based on everything that is already in place and attached. And that is, I know that this is a time when we're talking about youth engagement. If we think back to what our role has been in the Sabbath schools, what it can potentially be, what can our role be in terms of the camp movement, what's the women's role in terms of study of any kind, we are there. And we just need to keep on and on and on, including ourselves and intruding ourselves in whatever else is happening throughout the movement. Thank you.
My name is Karen Mays. My question is, this has all been very wonderful, and I'm also new to WRJ last year, and you maybe want to go back to school at the age of 50, so I can come work for a nonprofit. You talk about women being rabbis and in society. How about in another major part of our world, which is the military? I'm a veteran. Where do you see those my daughter, but where do you see more and more? It was very hard finding Jewish chaplains in the military. Do you see a lot of women graduating from HUC as Reformed rabbis and moving on to join the military?
But you bring up a very interesting point in that you said you served your time in the military and you just joined WRJ. Now, I don't know what other activities you're doing in your life, but you bring up a really important age group that I think can be of use to the College Institute and certainly with WRJ and other groups, namely folks, you know, all of us, thank God, will live, we hope, to a long life. Longer than used to be. So there's 2 decades or so, right, of play at the end of people's lives, and how will they continue to be useful to society and feel good and productive in society? And I think that's a huge role that WRJ could come to the fore and play a part of.